My phone rang at 9:47 on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after I'd cleared out my desk at Sovereign Capital. It was Chloe from what used to be my team, and her voice was shaking. The revenue portals are down, all of them. The board's walking into the main conference room right now, and nobody can pull up a single account, Chloe said rapidly, panic rising in her throat. I took a sip of my coffee, still warm. Okay, I said calmly. I didn't ask a single follow-up question, because I already knew the answer to every one of them. I'd known for 3 weeks. I just hadn't known it would happen on a Tuesday during a board meeting 13 minutes before the managing partner needed to present quarterly numbers. Welcome to Payback Office, the channel where the people quietly pushed aside finally get to tell their side. Glad you're here. My name is Eden Carlisle, and for 10 years I was the person at Sovereign Capital who made sure things actually worked, not the name in a box near the top of the org chart, but the one underneath all those boxes, holding the whole structure up so nobody above ever had to think about how much weight it was carrying. I never minded that arrangement. I liked the work. I liked knowing that when a client's quarterly statement generated at 4 in the morning without a single error, it was because I'd spent a Sunday afternoon rebuilding the reconciliation process from scratch. Nobody ever saw that Sunday. They just saw a statement that looked correct, which to most people looks like nothing at all. I was never the type who needed credit for that. I'd watched plenty of people chase it over the years, and it always looked exhausting, always performing, always positioning, always making sure the right person saw you do the thing. I didn't have the appetite for that. I had the appetite for the work itself, for the quiet satisfaction of a system that simply didn't break. That's not martyrdom. I was genuinely fully absorbed in work I found satisfying, so absorbed that I stopped paying attention to the one part of the job that actually mattered to the people above me, who got to stand next to the numbers when they looked good. I joined Sovereign Capital 10 years earlier as an operations associate, back when the firm managed roughly $400 million in client assets across maybe 60 households. By the time I left, that figure was closer to $2.5 billion, and nearly every system that made that growth survivable had my fingerprints buried somewhere underneath it. I built the reconciliation system that matched client statements against custodian records every single night. I rebuilt the revenue portal, the dashboard every advisor and director opened each morning twice. Once when the firm switched custodians, and once when the old system simply couldn't handle the volume anymore. Neither rebuild got a launch party. One Monday morning the portal just worked better than it had on Friday, and everyone went about their day assuming it had always been that way. For the first 3 years my job didn't have a title that made sense to anyone outside the firm. Operations associate was on paper, but what I actually did was notice things before they became problems. I built systems that worked invisibly, the kind that only became visible the moment they stopped happening. Jensen Lockhart joined Sovereign about 4 years into my time there, as a senior relationship director. He came from a bigger downtown firm, with a resume listing billions in assets under management and client relationships stretching back 15 years. What the resume didn't mention was that at his old firm, an entire operations team had been quietly cleaning up behind him the whole time. My first real interaction with him came about 6 weeks after he started. The custodian had changed a data format overnight without telling anyone. I caught it at 6 in the morning and had the reconciliation script patched and rerun by 8. Jensen wandered by my desk around 9, holding a printed statement. These numbers look different from yesterday. Is something wrong with the system? Jensen asked dismissively, holding the paper out as if he wanted someone to take it off his hands. There was a formatting issue from the custodian overnight. I caught it and corrected it before the batch went out. Those numbers are the right ones now, I said, not looking up from my screen. Oh good, Jensen said flatly, already turning to walk away. I didn't think much of it at the time, but it was the first small data point in what would become a very consistent pattern. Jensen Lockhart experienced the firm's infrastructure the way most people experience electricity. It was simply there, until it wasn't. A few months later I flagged an error in one of his client's fee calculations, a discrepancy that would have overcharged the client roughly $4,000 across a year. I sent a brief email explaining the issue and the fix. His reply landed within minutes. Thanks, you're a lifesaver. Don't know what we'd do without you. Jensen typed quickly, the exclamation point doing the work actual attention might otherwise have done. A nice thing to say, but some quiet, honest part of me noticed he meant it as a figure of speech, not a sentence with an actual answer underneath it. I'd spend the next several years finding out exactly what they'd do without me. The years pass the way years do when you're good at your job and nobody's watching the clock for you. Jensen's years moved differently. His moved upward. By his third year at Sovereign, he'd been promoted to Director of Client Relations. The managing partner, a man named Holloway, had taken a shine to him. Jensen, with his easy charm and his knack for making every client feel important, looked exactly like the next chapter to someone who'd stopped paying close attention. I got promoted too to Senior Operations Manager, which came with a small raise, a slightly heavier workload, and absolutely no change in how visible any of it was. By then I managed a team of 3, running the reconciliation systems, the revenue portal, the client reporting pipeline, and the compliance documentation that kept the firm's regulatory filings clean. One March, Jensen stopped by my office to ask if I'd looked over the draft of his presentation for the audit kickoff meeting. "These look great. I think you might want to double-check the AUM figure on slide 4 though. It's using last quarter's number instead of the current one," I said, still typing. "Oh yeah, I'll have someone fix that," Jensen said casually, already heading for the door. That was around the time I started noticing a particular phrase Jensen used whenever something at the firm worked well. "We built that," he'd say in client meetings, firm-wide emails, casual hallway conversations that always somehow drifted near Holloway's office door. "We built that reporting system. We streamlined that process. We've really tightened up our operations." I don't think he was lying exactly. Jensen genuinely believed it. He'd never once had to ask himself how any of it actually worked. The portal loaded every morning. The statements were accurate. The audits went smoothly. From where Jensen stood, those things were simply properties of sovereign capital, ambient, permanent, not the result of anyone's effort, least of all his. The thing about people like that is they're not unkind. Jensen was perfectly pleasant to work with. He remembered my name. He asked about my weekend once, and when I mentioned taking some online courses toward a certification, he told me that was a great idea and he'd love to hear how it went. He probably did mean it. That was almost the worst part. There was no malice anywhere in Jensen Lockhart, which meant there was nothing to push back against. Just a man slowly, cheerfully convinced that the floor he stood on was something he'd built with his own hands, and a woman a few offices down who'd poured the concrete for it, one quiet weekend at a time. By the time Jensen made senior director, I'd stopped expecting recognition. Holloway announced his retirement on a Friday afternoon. He'd stay on as chairman, mostly a ceremonial role. Day-to-day leadership of the firm would shift to a newly created position, managing director of client services, overseeing all advisor teams, client relationships, and operations. Jensen got the job. Nobody was surprised. For the first few months, almost nothing changed for me directly. I still reported to the same operations VP I always had, a woman named Odalis who understood exactly what my team did and why it mattered. She'd been quietly pushing for years to get my role reclassified, to get me a title that actually matched what I did. 6 months into Jensen's new role, Odalis left for a position at another firm. Nobody replaced her. Instead, operations was folded directly under Jensen. For efficiency, my team now reported to him. The first sign of what that would actually mean surfaced about 2 months later. The firm was discussing next year's budget, and someone raised the question of headcount in operations. According to Chloe, Jensen said, "Operations runs pretty smoothly at this point. I think we're probably overstaffed there, honestly," looking at a slide showing the department's near-perfect audit record. Nobody in the room connected the smoothness to the staffing. Jensen looked at 4 years of nothing going wrong and concluded nothing needed to be done. A few weeks after that, he called me into his office. "I wanted to talk to you about some restructuring we're thinking about for next year," Jensen said from behind his desk, scrolling through something on his laptop as he spoke. "Okay," I said evenly, taking a seat. "Your team's been doing great work. Really, the operations stuff runs like clockwork these days. I think that actually creates an opportunity for us to think about things differently going forward," Jensen said, smiling like he was delivering good news. "What kind of opportunity?" I asked calmly. "Nothing set in stone yet. Just keep doing what you're doing. You're the best at it," Jensen said warmly, already turning back to his laptop. I left his office and went back to my desk. I kept doing what I was doing because that's what I always did, and because I genuinely hadn't yet grasped that keep doing what you're doing, and we're thinking about things differently weren't in conflict at all in Jensen Lockhart's mind. 3 months isn't long, but it was long enough. The restructuring Jensen had mentioned took shape in pieces. A new applicant tracking system, a consultant brought in to map our operational workflows, a hiring freeze that somehow didn't apply to one specific posting. Operations coordinator, entry-level, recent graduates encouraged to apply. I saw the job listing before anyone told me about it. The responsibilities were almost word for word my own job description from 10 years earlier. It all came together 4 weeks later on a Wednesday, when Jensen asked me to stop by his office at the end of the day. His door was half closed when I arrived. So, I wanted to talk through some of the changes coming with the new operational structure, Jensen said, squaring papers on his desk that didn't need squaring. Sure, I said, waiting. We've brought on someone, just finished her degree, really sharp, very eager. And honestly, with the new workflow software the consultants set up, a lot of the day-to-day stuff is going to be a lot more streamlined going forward. Templated, basically, Jensen said, as if it were a compliment. What does that mean for my role? I asked flatly. We found someone who can manage the day-to-day for a fraction of the cost, honestly. And look, 10 years is incredible. But a lot of what you've been doing she'll be able to pick up pretty quickly with the new system. I think she's going to be great, Jensen said with a smile. So you're letting me go, I said, no question mark. It's not, it's a restructuring. It's not about you specifically. We just think this is the direction that makes sense for the team going forward, Jensen said, visibly uncomfortable, using words he'd clearly rehearsed. Okay, I said calmly. That was it. That was the entire conversation. 10 years, and the word that ended it was okay. Not because I had nothing left to say, but because I understood that anything else I said in that room would be wasted on him. He wasn't going to understand what he'd just done. Understanding wasn't available to Jensen in that moment. I stood up, thanked him for letting me know, and walked back to my desk, and somewhere on that walk I made a decision so small it barely felt like a decision at all. I decided I was done holding it up. If you've stayed with me this far, you already know how this ends, but stick around to see exactly how it happens. We're closing in on 7,000 subscribers here at Payback Office, and every one of you watching quietly means more than you'd think. I worked my final 2 weeks exactly the way I'd worked every week before them. Jensen asked, almost as an afterthought, whether I'd be willing to help onboard my replacement. Her name was Tally Sharp, eager, fresh out of a finance program. I liked her right away, in the careful way you like someone who's about to be handed a job nobody bothered to properly explain to them. For 2 weeks I walked her through the parts of the job that had names, how to pull the morning reconciliation report, how to navigate the revenue portal's dashboard view, where the client statement templates lived. These were the parts that existed in writing, the parts a consultant could map onto a flowchart. What I didn't show her were the other things, the early morning checks I ran before the custodian's data format could quietly shift overnight, the manual flag I'd built into the reconciliation script that caught a specific kind of rounding error the system itself couldn't see, the relationships I'd built with 2 people at the custodian support desk who'd take my calls directly and fix things in an afternoon. I thought about whether to tell her the rest, the parts that weren't written anywhere, that lived only in 10 years of paying attention. And I decided not to. Not out of spite, but out of something quieter. The simple recognition that those things had never been mine to give away for free, and nobody had ever once asked for them, because nobody at Sovereign Capital had ever known they existed in the first place. Jensen had described my job to Tally as something a new system and 2 weeks of training could replace. So I taught her the job Jensen had described. I just didn't teach her the job I'd actually done. My last day was a Friday, and it was almost aggressively unremarkable. I packed 10 years into 4 boxes. Chloe took me to lunch. A few people signed a card. Jensen stopped by my desk around 4, shook my hand and told me it had been a pleasure. We'll definitely stay in touch, Jensen said insincerely, hand already on the door. Take care, Jensen, I said pleasantly. I drove home that evening with 4 boxes in the back seat, and somewhere around the 3rd stoplight from the office, something settled in my chest. Not quite relief, not quite grief either, closer to the feeling of setting down a bag you've carried so long your shoulders forgotten it's supposed to feel different without it. The portals would still run that night and the next morning, and probably for a while after that. Momentum is a real thing. But momentum isn't maintenance. And starting that Friday evening, nobody at Sovereign Capital was doing either one for the things I used to quietly hold together. I slept in. I took long walks. I updated my resume for the first time since I'd been hired, and was startled by how much of it there was, and how little of it anyone at Sovereign would have recognized as mine. I heard from Chloe about 3 weeks in. Portal's been glitchy all week. They say they're looking into it. Miss you LOL, Chloe texted casually. I smiled a little at that. I knew exactly what glitchy meant, and I knew exactly what they'd find when they looked into it. Nothing. Because the thing that had been quietly correcting itself every morning for years wasn't a setting anyone could find. It was a person, and that person had stopped showing up at 6. A week after that, Chloe texted again. Hey, random Q. Did you used to manually check something with the custodian feed every morning? Tally mentioned the numbers looked weird on a few accounts, and nobody can figure out where the discrepancy's coming from. Chloe asked uncertainly. I read it twice. There it was, the first thread pulled just slightly loose. A few accounts. A few $100 here, a rounding error there. Nothing that would set off alarms. I'm sure they'll figure it out. Hope it's nothing, I replied, meaning the second half more than the first because I knew with the specific certainty of someone who'd built the thing they were now trying to diagnose, that nothing in any manual pointed back to a 6 a.m. habit that no longer existed. Chloe didn't push. Why would she? It was a few accounts. It was Tally's first month. New hires made mistakes, systems had hiccups, and at a firm the size of Sovereign, a handful of small discrepancies were exactly the kind of thing that got logged, shrugged at, and quietly folded into next quarter's pile. I started a new role during that stretch at a smaller firm across town doing work that was almost entirely visible, a place that had never had the luxury of taking its operations for granted. It felt like starting over with people who already knew what they didn't know. I thought about Sovereign occasionally, the way you think about a house you used to live in, not with longing, just a background awareness that it was still standing somewhere. What I didn't know yet was that the rounding error Tally had noticed wasn't isolated. It was one thread among dozens, all connected to the same invisible structure. And somewhere on Jensen Lockhart's calendar, already scheduled, sat a board meeting. The kind where the managing partners from the firm's largest institutional client would log into the revenue portal themselves to review the numbers personally before signing off on a renewed contract. Nobody at Sovereign was thinking about that meeting yet. It was just a date on a calendar. The weeks between Chloe's text and the morning everything fell apart weren't dramatic. I had a new job, a new desk, new people who said good morning and meant it. Sovereign existed mostly in the past tense for me by then. But I've pieced together what happened, mostly from Chloe, and once you line it all up, it reads less like a series of separate problems and more like a single structure settling after the foundation underneath quietly stopped being maintained. The custodian changed their data format again, the same kind of overnight shift I used to catch at 6 in the morning. Except this time nobody caught it at 6. Nobody caught it at all, until Thursday's batch of client statements went out with cost basis figures that were, across roughly 40 accounts, quietly and consistently wrong. It took 5 days for a client to notice. A retired orthodontist in Scottsdale who developed the habit of checking his own portfolio line by line against his statements. He called his advisor, mildly annoyed, asking why his cost basis on a municipal bond fund had jumped by $11,000 overnight. The advisor escalated it to Tally, who ran the reconciliation report exactly the way I'd shown her. Came back clean. Of course it did. The error wasn't in how the numbers were being checked. It was in the layer beneath that, the layer where I used to sit at 6 in the morning comparing the raw custodian feed against what the portal expected to receive, a comparison that existed nowhere in any documentation. Tally spent 2 days on it before escalating to IT, who spent another 4 before someone finally thought to call the custodian directly, who confirmed they'd updated their file format the previous week. By the time it was fixed, roughly 10 days later, the 40 affected accounts had to be individually corrected, restated, and in 6 cases reissued with formal correction letters, the kind that go out on letterhead, get reviewed by compliance, and get logged in a file auditors examine closely. Jensen, according to Chloe, was annoyed about it. Annoyed in the specific way of someone who experiences a problem as an interruption rather than as information. He told her to make sure this doesn't happen again, which she did by adding an alert, a fix that covered maybe a third of what the 6 a.m. check used to catch. The second thing happened about 3 weeks later. One of the support contacts I'd cultivated at the custodian over the years left the company. Nobody at Sovereign knew it mattered because nobody had ever known those relationships existed in the first place. The next time something needed fixing quickly, Tally called the custodian's general support line. The ticket sat for 9 days. By the time it was resolved, the fee discrepancy had compounded across 2 billing cycles on accounts that included 3 of the firm's largest institutional relationships. None of this was really anyone's fault. Tally was doing the job she'd been trained for, competently responding to the problems she could actually see. Jensen was running the firm the way he'd always run it, confidently, in the rooms where confidence was what got noticed. Every individual decision in isolation was reasonable. But reasonable decisions made by people who don't know what they don't know accumulate. A single missing person doesn't create a single missing function. It creates dozens of small, scattered absences, each one survivable on its own. It's only when you stack them over a few months that you get something resembling a structure with its load-bearing walls slowly, invisibly removed. And all of it was converging on a single date, the quarterly review with Sovereign's largest institutional client. The morning it happened, I was at my new desk with a cup of coffee, reviewing onboarding documents for a client, documents that were both accurate and current, because somebody there had actually written down how things worked. What I didn't know was that 3 things had converged on Sovereign Capital that morning. None dramatic on its own, all quietly waiting for each other. The first was the security certificate on the revenue portal, a credential authenticating the portal's connection to the custodian servers, set to expire annually, renewable in about 15 minutes by whoever happened to remember it was coming due. I'd renewed it myself every year for 9 years, usually a week or 2 early, usually without telling anyone. Nobody had renewed it this year. There was no calendar reminder because the reminder had lived in my head. At 12 minutes past midnight, the certificate quietly expired, and by 6 the next morning, the portal stopped authenticating. Every advisor, every director, including Jensen, logging in that morning found a blank dashboard and an error message. The second thing was the board meeting. The firm's largest institutional relationship, a regional pension consortium worth almost $400 million in assets, had scheduled its quarterly investment committee review for that same morning, and for the first time in years, 2 of their analysts had asked to log directly into the portal to review performance and fee data ahead of a contract renewal vote. The third thing was everything underneath those 2. The 40 restated accounts, the compounding fee discrepancies across 3 institutional relationships, the rounding errors that had been quietly piling up for months in a corner nobody monitored anymore. Jensen walked into the building that morning already 15 minutes behind, expecting to pull up the portal in the conference room and walk the consortium's analysts through their numbers the way he'd done a dozen times before. Instead, he got a blank screen, a room full of people waiting, and within about 20 minutes, a call from the consortium's lead analyst asking whether there was an issue accessing the portal. Must be a glitch, IT's looking into it. Jensen laughed nervously, trying to cover. IT couldn't fix it quickly because fixing it meant identifying that a certificate had expired, which meant knowing the certificate existed, which meant knowing where it lived in the system's configuration, a piece of information that existed in exactly 0 documents. While IT scrambled, the consortium's analysts started asking other questions. One noticed a fee figure on a printed summary that didn't match the previous quarter's number by an amount small on its own but consistent across several accounts, in a way that looked less like a rounding quirk and more like a billing error quietly compounding. By the time the portal came back online, almost 90 minutes later, the analysts had already shifted from reviewing performance numbers to politely but pointedly requesting a full audit of the fee calculations on their accounts going back 2 years. Jensen spent the rest of that day behind a closed office door on the phone, first with the consortium's relationship lead, trying to reassure her this was an isolated technical issue, then with Holloway, whose voice was loud enough that people 2 offices down could hear the tone of it. Somewhere during that second call, Jensen, apparently scrolling back through old emails looking for documentation, found a thread from 9 years earlier. A short message with the subject line "Cert Renewal Done," sent by me. Chloe said that was the first time in the 6 months since I'd left that she'd heard Jensen say my name out loud. My phone rang about 20 minutes after that. The revenue portals are down, all of them. The board's walking into the main conference room right now, and nobody can pull up a single account, Chloe said, breathless and panicked. I took a sip of my coffee. Still warm. Okay, I said calmly. I'm trying to run the mid-month revenue report for the managing partner, and the system keeps timing out. I saw you used to send these. Is there a trick to getting it to process? Chloe asked desperately. I don't work there anymore, Chloe, I said gently. I know, but nobody can access anything. Tally can't figure out how to refresh the client portals and clients are furious. Can you just point me in the right direction? Chloe pleaded. I'm sure they'll figure it out, I said, kindly but firmly. Please, Eden, can you just tell me which system to log into? The managing partner's losing his mind. The board members are already in the conference room, Chloe begged, speaking faster than she was breathing. I hope you all figure it out, I said calmly and ended the call. 3 minutes later, my phone rang again. A different number. I let it go to voicemail. When I played it back an hour later, it was Holloway. Eden, it's Chairman Holloway. I'm told you're no longer with the company, which is news to me, and I'm currently in a board meeting where I cannot access any of the quarterly financial data. I need you to call me back immediately. This is extremely urgent, Holloway said tightly, controlled fury barely masked because he was standing in front of important people. I deleted the voicemail and made myself lunch. The full story reached me in pieces over the next 72 hours, from people who'd worked with me and were watching the disaster unfold from the inside. The quarterly board meeting was a catastrophe. Holloway had to present revenue projections without any actual revenue data. The dashboards I'd maintained were completely inaccessible. Tally had the password for the front-end system, but didn't know the back-end databases required separate authentication that reset every 90 days. That authentication had expired 4 days earlier. Holloway improvised using summary numbers from the previous quarter, which only prompted detailed follow-up questions he couldn't answer. The meeting ran 2 hours over schedule and ended with the board chair suggesting Sovereign's internal controls needed serious examination. When IT finally cracked open the systems I'd maintained, they discovered the quarterly data had never been properly reconciled. Tally had been running reports, but pulling from the preliminary data feeds instead of the reconciled versions. Every number Sovereign's leadership had been citing for client performance over the previous 6 weeks was wrong. Not dramatically, maybe 3 to 7% off, but wrong enough that when the board compared Jensen's verbal updates from May against the actual corrected data, the discrepancies were obvious and unexplainable. Then the client complaints started rolling in. Pemberton Industrial, one of Sovereign's oldest accounts, sent a formal letter demanding to know why their quarterly statement showed portfolio activity from 2019. 2 other clients reported similar issues. Tally was trying her best, but her best didn't include knowledge of systems that predated her birth, or integrations that existed nowhere except in custom scripts I'd written and maintained. Jensen kept telling her to figure it out, which is what you say when you also don't know how something works. The consortium's audit request wasn't something fixed in a day. It took nearly 3 months, involved an outside accounting firm, and turned up exactly what I'd have expected. Not fraud, nothing dramatic, just months of small, compounding billing errors across several of the firm's largest accounts. The kind of thing that individually looks like nothing and in aggregate looks like a pattern of carelessness. The consortium didn't renew. Neither did 2 of the other large relationships quietly affected by the same compounding errors. Not dramatically, not with angry phone calls, just the quiet attrition that happens when clients who'd never had reason to question a firm suddenly find one. Holloway came out of retirement for about 6 months. Jensen kept his title technically through all of it, but most of the major client relationships were quietly redistributed to other directors for stability, and he spent most of his days in meetings that never seemed to go anywhere. As far as I know, he never once asked anyone what had actually gone wrong. I don't think he ever fully understood that anything had changed, only that somehow the floor beneath him had gotten a little less solid. As for me, I've been at my new firm over a year now. It's smaller and the work is satisfying in a different way. Here, when something I build works well, people notice. A few months ago, my manager asked me to help redesign the reconciliation process from the ground up, and this time I wrote everything down. Every check, every relationship, every quiet 6 a.m. habit. Not because I think I'll ever leave the way I left Sovereign, but because I learned what happens to a structure when the person holding it up forgets to leave instructions. Some mornings I still wake around 5:30 out of old habit, and for a moment I almost reach for my laptop before I remember there's nothing waiting for me that I haven't already accounted for. Those mornings I make coffee instead and sit on my porch for a while before the day starts, which is as close to a happy ending as a story like this gets. Not loud, not triumphant, just quiet, in a way that finally belongs to me. If this story felt familiar, if you've ever been the person holding something together that nobody else could see, we're almost at 7,000 subscribers here at Payback Office, And we'd love to have you with us for the next one. Thanks for listening.